All your devices silenced.
Sorry, new watch. I'm like, I muted that.
I just got back from the East Coast yesterday.
Yeah. That's tough.
Oh, it's 5:30. Got some liquid in it.
It's fresh. It's fresh. Don't worry.
It's just last week. Fresh, I promise.
I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Would the city clerk please call the roll?
Counselor Long,
Present.
Counselor McLaughlin is absent. Counselor Runyon,
Present.
Counselor Randall,
Present.
Counselor Richardson,
Present.
Mayor Mates.
Present. Would everyone please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag
Of the United States of
America
and to the republic for which it stands,
one
nation, under God,
indivisible.
With liberty and
justice
for all.
I get a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved. Second it.
It's moved by Counselor Richardson and seconded by Counselor Randall to approve the agenda. Is there any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Moving right on along, item 5, discussion items. Is it you or Dave or? Okay, our Director of Public Works will recognize him.
Thank you, Honorable Mayor, members of council. So tonight we're going to be talking about some of the financial plan elements of our water master plan update. As you know, we've been working on this project for over a year now. We're trying to make sure that we have a very detailed 20-year water master plan with some projections to 50 years out of this project. I was like, my microphone's coming and going. A lot of work has been done since we last met in April. Since that time, we have evaluated the city's existing water utility infrastructure. We have projected the water demands for the community into the future. And we've developed a capital improvement plan that is being recommended to meet those demands in the future and continue to have a reliable water system. Now we're going to start talking more detail about our concepts for how to pay for that, what those costs are projected to be, and also to be getting some guidance from the city council on certain policy matters related to water utility funding and financing. With us tonight, we have Brian Genter with Consor Engineering. They're the prime contractor for this Water Master Plan update. He's been the project manager. And we also have Deb Glardy of Glardy Consulting, who has been undertaking the financial analysis associated with this effort. And with that, I just turn it over to Brian to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Dave. So what we're going to go ahead and cover tonight is kind of an overview of the plan, but really, as Dave said, focus on the financial element. But I will walk you through what's in the plan at a high level, spend some time on what's in the capital improvement program so you have an understanding of what things are going to cost and why as we go into the discussion of the financial analysis. And I was just going to relate that Emily Flock on our team isn't with us tonight. She got ill on Friday and decided it would be better probably not to bring her germs to join you today. So she's kept them at home, so she won't be presenting, but you will see her at a later date. A quick overview, we'll talk about what's in the master plan, spend a little time on the historical development of the water system because it's relevant to where you are today and where you're going here in the next 20 years. Talk about those recommended improvements in the draft CIP, and then I'll hand it over to Deb and she'll talk about the financial analysis, policy discussion, number of topics that she'll walk you through, and then we'll wrap up with some next steps. Feel free to interrupt us along the way. There's a lot of content here. We can pause as we go and discuss and dive deep into any of these pieces as we go that you want to discuss. So I'll just start with an overview of what's in the water system master plan. I'm going to break it into 4 parts. The first is sort of the foundation. It's the where are we? So inventory of the existing system, forecast of demand through the 20-year and a longer 50-year planning horizon. So we're looking at what's going to be the need here in the near term, but also long term. We want to make sure that we talk about larger projects, improvements that they're sized not just for 20 years, but for a 50 or 75-year time frame. We establish criteria for analyzing the system. That's kind of the foundation. Then we move into the system analysis piece. So we develop the hydraulic model, we calibrate it, do analysis. So the calibration is to make sure that the model accurately reflects flow and pressure in the system in real life. And then we can do what-if scenarios for those future conditions. We'll look at supply and treatment needs. That's a significant piece of this plan and where the city's at today, storage and pumping needs. And then we look at seismic resiliency. It's a big topic here in Oregon. The Dalles sits kind of right on the cusp of an area that could be impacted by the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. You also have local faults of concern. So we want to make sure we're considering those issues. All of this culminates in the development of the capital improvement plan. What are the improvements that are needed to meet the deficiencies we identify in terms of capacity, reliability, resilience, and maintenance? A lot of your improvements, I'll just foreshadow it, have to do with system resilience, reliability, and renewal of infrastructure. And then finally, the financial analysis and the water system master plan report. So an evaluation of your utility rate structure, your system development charges, and then the water system master plan document itself that goes through both city council approval and approval by the drinking water program from the state of Oregon.
Could you touch real quick on the climate resiliency?
Oh, thank you. That's the other piece. So as we talk about supply and treatment needs, we look at it from a capacity standpoint, a performance standpoint, so water quality, and we also looked at climate resilience in particular to see what are the potential impacts of climate change on the city's supply, given that you're dependent on a surface water supply up in the watershed that is, this is a water scarce region. So understanding what happens as water patterns shift over time, what is that impact on your supply as well? So that was built into the supply and treatment analysis. Just talking a little bit about the history of the city's water system, it's interesting to see this kind of generational investments that have been made over time. So going back to the 1890s, when the city made the decision to purchase the private water system that served residents here and establish a municipal water system for the city. And then rolling forward to just after the turn of the century, the development of the pipeline that is the old wooden Dog River pipeline. And I'll jump around a little bit, but then skipping forward into the 40s and 50s, the development of the Wicks water treatment plant, Cirrhosis Reservoir in town, and then skipping forward again, Crow Creek Dam in the 60s. The 80s, investments within the city system, reservoirs, wells, and then continuing today with the recently completed new, or just being completed new Dog River Pipeline. So this is a great story of what is pretty typical in a water system. You've got these generational investments that need to be made, and then you even see in this timeline, you're already into the phase of renewal of some of those assets that were developed by generations before you. And this is going to be a continuing theme in this master plan, that you've got assets that have reached the end of their life. It's time to continue that renewal process, to continue to make the investments that the prior generations made, investments that future generations will need to continue. So using the same map, I'm going to highlight kind of what are the big investments that are coming out of this master plan. And I'll start up in the watershed again and kind of work our way down. So you've made the investment in the Dog River Pipeline. That's an asset that now is going to last this community for decades to come. The next piece is looking at what do you do with Crow Creek Dam? And one of the things we identified is that ultimately, there's likely to be a need to raise that dam to expand the raw water storage. And there's two reasons for that. One is that shift due to climate change is going to result in most likely rainfall earlier and less snowmelt, which means that you're going to need to capture more of that water to be able to get through the summer season. And so looking first at making sure we understand what does that dam raise cost look like. There aren't a lot of dam raises happening in Oregon these days. And so there's not a wealth of knowledge around that. One of the things we want to do is make sure we understand what's the timeline for that project and make sure we've got updated costs that accurately reflect what the community needs to plan for. But we identified that the dam raise likely can be pushed out to the end of the 20-year planning horizon, possibly beyond. And we've prioritized other projects first so that there's certainty around what's happening with shifting water use patterns in the city before the city has to embark on such a significant investment. Then continuing down the watershed, the water treatment plant, the Wicks water treatment plant has reached the end of its useful life. From a capacity standpoint, it's near the capacity that's needed, but that facility really is at the end of its life. And so renewal and replacement of that plant that includes some expansion, largely around being able to treat more cold winter water. So that's one of the things the plant struggles with today, is to be able to treat at capacity in the winter. And as we continue down the line, we'll kind of highlight why that's important. We want to maximize the capacity of that plant when there's winter water available, because we can use that, we can store it and use it later in the ASR system. The next piece is replacement of the transmission mains between Wicks and town. So 2 steel mains that, again, were built over 75 years ago. It's time to replace those. They've reached the end of their life. They're vulnerable. So we've identified that as another high priority project. So now I've hit on the big 3, so we'll call them the big 3 projects in this master plan. They're not the only things, but those are the most significant. Once we get into town, the biggest near-term improvement is additional facilities down in the Riverside area. So additional storage beyond what's being developed currently, and an additional pump station expansion to add capacity there to serve the lower part of town, the industrial area. And then scattered in amongst that, you've got distribution main renewal and replacement that has to continue to happen, fire flow improvements, other pump station upgrades and expansion, future planning studies that have to continue, SCADA upgrades that are currently underway, seismic and wildfire resilience improvements throughout the city, and then the ASR program planning and additional ASR wells, which we see as a critical part of your bridge between where you're at today and where you're going in terms of supply. So if ASR is as successful as it could be, there's the ability to store winter water in those ASR wells at a much lower cost than raising the dam. And so we want to prioritize that first, take advantage of the infrastructure that's currently being built, the potential additional infrastructure that could be built, maximize the use of water from the Wicks water treatment plant in the winter when it's available, but store it underground in wells in the city rather than embark on an expensive dam raise. We have the dam raise in there, knowing that it may be needed, but prioritizing those other improvements first and trying to take advantage of the aquifer storage and recovery potential that exists.
Question, or should I wait?
He said he encouraged us to go ahead, so.
All right. Good evening. Riverside BPS storage phase 2 is that an ASR project or no?
So that's actually above ground distribution system storage. So there's 2.5 million gallon reservoirs currently design or construction. I get this. 1.25. Thank you. Total of 2.5. Thank you. Total of 2.5 million gallons. This would be an additional. We're working through the numbers a little bit still, but I'm going to say 4 million gallons of storage that would be on the site that's already been identified for future expansion.
Need to build new reservoir tanks.
So it'd be new tanks. Yeah. That'd be one new tank or possibly two. I think that's a value engineering decision at the time when it needs to be built of split it into two or just build a single one.
And the big three, I haven't obviously had time to flip through all this yet. The big three projects you're identifying are Crow Creek Wicks and replacement of transmission.
That's correct.
All right.
Yeah. And they all are, I'll just foreshadow it, they're all in the range of $40 to $60 million projects. So very significant investments in the water system today.
Thank you.
The transmission line, that transmission line, I remember the report you gave us in April identified the years, the estimated age of the lines, but I don't think on the map it showed that particular line. And are they different sections, different ages, or it's not all just, it wasn't built at one time?
It was all built. I'm gonna defer to Dave a little bit to make sure I have this right. I'm gonna answer to start, but most of it was built in the early 70s, and Dave, you might add some.
Yeah, and I think that's correct. There was transmission pipelines before the ones that exist now. When the city first was getting into the water business that came from the old Wicks Reservoir, even before the treatment plant was built. The current lines were built in the 70s. And there are a few sections that were upgraded, mainly where they crossed draws and got blown out in 1996 flood. But generally speaking, it's two continuous pipelines of approximately the same age.
So I'll shift from kind of the graphical illustration to kind of a summary of the capital improvement plan through these here quickly. So top priorities are in the first 10 years of the plan, and it is a significant number. So you see, this is a fairly front-loaded plan. We worked hard to identify what could be pushed out. And unfortunately, there isn't a lot. Most of these are needed either because of the age of the existing infrastructure, the opportunity they present to delay other significant improvements, or they are capacity related, or else increase resilience of the system at a lower cost. So the SCADA improvements are projects that are underway currently. The Wicks water treatment plant replacement and expansion is the highest priority project. Got that identified to begin immediately. And again, one of the reasons is that you're not able to fully take advantage of the amount of water available in the winter for ASR currently. And so we want to get that improvement done, be able to start banking as much water in ASR as possible to understand whether or not that will allow you to bridge and push the dam raise out even further. This is especially important, again, in a community where it is water scarce here. There will be low years where there won't be a lot of water available to store. And so we want to take advantage of as many of those high water years as early as possible to start to bank stored water. Again, the transmission main replacements, programming, planning for the ASR. So there's no certainty with ASR. That's the one risk here. Until you put water in the ground for multiple seasons and have a record of it, there's always a little bit of risk that you won't be able to store as much as you had hoped. There could be some water quality issues. And so we want to get that started soon and understand what's the full potential of ASR to meet the city's long-term needs. Similarly, as I said, the Crow Creek Dam expansion, really looking at what does that project look like, doing some preliminary engineering and laying out a timeline for it so that the city has clear guidance on when it might need to start, if in fact you need to do it, because that is a project that is a decade-long project or more. Your experience with Dog River, I think the Dog River pipeline is telling in terms of that. And so this is that same type of project where you've got a lot of stakeholders external that have to be worked with, a lot of permitting that has to happen. And we want to make sure that you have a timeline to start early enough. Beyond that, it's distribution pipeline improvements, potentially additional ASR wells. If the first ASR well plays out well, if the second well at the Riverside is converted to ASR, then there is the opportunity potentially to expand that significantly. Mentioned the booster pump station and storage already, and then some resilience improvements. It gets a little easier in the medium term, but we pivot more to, in this phase, more of a renewal and replacement program. We're focused on fire flow improvements and piping improvements in the city, with the potential that the Crow Creek Dam project will be moving at this point. So that's design and permitting. We haven't gotten to the large dollars yet, but that's starting through the process. And then in the long term, the 20 to 50-year window, again, it's a large number because we've got a lot of years of pipeline renewal and replacement. But then the large project is the Crow Creek Dam construction, if required. And there will be a requirement no matter what. Even if the dam isn't expanded, there are spillway improvements that would need to happen. They would be a lower cost, but still a significant project. And so we want to capture those here. I'll pause for a minute because that's a lot of projects and improvements, but that's kind of what makes up what is ultimately a $300 million CIP plus $300 million plus CIP over the 50-year horizon. So these are significant investments in the water system. In today's dollars, similar to the kind of investments that have been made over the last 100 years, but still significant and a lot condensed into a pretty short time as you get to the point where a lot of your infrastructure has reached the end of its useful life and renewal is necessary, in addition to some capacity expansion.
So that's actually a good question. Are these in today's dollars or have you projected out a typical inflation rate?
So these are all presented in 2024 dollars to give a uniform basis. As I hand it over to Deb and she talks about the financial analysis, she will be presenting it in the context of inflated dollars in the future.
Thank you.
The top priorities, 0 to 10 years. I think I know the answer to this question, but I think it bears repeating. And that is that what, if any, of those projects are a result of Google building data centers in our port area?
So the ASR planning and expansion is a critical one. The Riverside Booster Pump Station, Riverside Storage are the three most significant, and then potentially additional ASR wells are the three most significant. The WICS replacement and expansion would have to happen regardless. The expansion wouldn't be as significant, but most of the cost is in replacement. There's not a lot of incremental additional costs for the expanded capacity. Similarly, the transmission main replacements, we're not proposing expanded capacity. That is replacement at near the existing capacity because it's adequate to serve Google currently.
Okay, and Google is paying the cost of any any infrastructure improvements down in that area. Is that correct?
They're paying, excuse me, thank you for the question. They're paying the costs of the 2 new wells that are currently under construction, including the first ASR well. And they're paying for the construction of the Riverside Booster Station with its first 4 pumps, but that station's expandable to be able to accommodate up to 7 pumps as additional development on the port might occur. And this plan anticipates all the needs within the urban growth boundary. So, and that's within the existing urban growth boundary. So we're looking ahead to if other properties within the urban growth boundary develop these additional reservoirs that he's mentioned, and the increase in the pump station will be needed to support that. Yeah, so the 2 wells, the 2 reservoirs, and the initial construction of the pump station are what Google's paying for now. And those are supplies that were anticipated to be able to meet the needs of the 2 new data centers under construction. But we still have a lot of other, we have other industrial users out there that can expand over time as well.
So Dave, when we agreed, when we made an agreement with Google, part of that was a number of water system improvements. I do not recall the bullet list of what all of those were right off the top of my head. Was BPS, the Riverside BPS and Riverside Storage Phase 2, were those on that list, or are these new?
Phase 2 was not. Phase 1 was built with the capability to be expanded in the future to meet the additional city needs. So they are building Phase 1.
Yeah.
They're building the 225 million, or excuse me, 1.25 million gallon reservoirs that are the Riverside reservoirs currently under construction. And then the 2 new wells, they're paying for that. And that includes, as I mentioned, the first ASR well. Second well that they're paying for and is being constructed will be capable of being upgraded to accommodate ASR in the future. So we didn't build past an opportunity. It's just not going to have all the additional piping and valving from day one. And the converting it to ASR was not on the list. Converting the second well to ASR was not on their list of improvements.
Right. But the phase two, the two phase two storage projects here, that's something they will be.
Those are not on their list. Those are things that are in our capital improvement plan to address additional growth in the port area and the entire 310 zone in the future.
Do we have a estimate somewhere of what those are? How much are we proposing to or discussing to spend to expand industrial capacity under this is my question.
Think, do you have that off the top of your head?
Basically, I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head. The reservoirs is about 12 million of the CIP. The booster pump station expansion is pretty small because it's just adding pumps in the existing building. It's probably another $500,000
Sure.
offhand. Those are the primary ones that are specifically for the 310 zone. So they would serve all of the industrial customers. There's some residential as well, but that's primarily the industrial part of the city.
So 12 and a half-ish. All right. Thank you.
That I will hand it over to Deb and.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. And this is on? Yes. All right, well. So we've got for the, let's see, that's. Oh. The picture. A large plan to fund. So we've got, 4 components of our financial analysis framework. That includes development of a long-term financial plan, looking that evaluates, there you go, the overall revenue needs to fund the plan. And then these other little pieces of the puzzle are designed to determine how much each group of customers should pay, both sort of new growth versus existing, different types of customer classes, and then designing the rates within the classes to help pay for capital program as well as the ongoing operation and maintenance needs. So obviously, big objective here is to develop a plan that will provide for these additional investments in an equitable manner and supporting other community objectives around affordability, water conservation, et cetera. One thing about, just to note on the systems development charges, we're not presenting detailed updated systems development charges tonight. What I will talk about a little bit though is just how much of the planned improvements are growth related and, how that might supplement the funding sources that we're presenting as well. We will come back at the next meeting with that information. When we were here in April, we talked about how the current rates have very limited capacity for capital improvements based on the current customer base and usage levels as they are today. And so you're really just that little tiny bit at the top. You're have been dipping into reserves to pay for some things in recent years. And so growing the revenue base will take a combination of factors that include rate increases as well as there is projected industrial growth that will help offset the unit price increases that other customers have to pay. There are also opportunities to leverage Water Infrastructure Finance Innovation Act funds, perhaps. We'll talk about that as a potential mechanism for funding this, a good chunk of the big three part of the program. And also talk about the impacts of dedicating some of the SIP funds to help for the water improvements as well. So all the numbers that were present tonight are preliminary. They're based on the prioritization that Brian laid out. And so there will be some fine tuning, I think, in terms of just the scheduling of projects and, you know, putting together a plan is very dependent on having some idea of when the timing of those improvements, because we need to make sure that there's money that's going to be available at the time that the project is shovel ready. So we've done a preliminary projection of cash flow, of revenues, and other requirements of the system. So when we look at the revenues, it's right now looking at the current SDCs, current capital reserves, then taking into account the private development contributions, as was noted, there has been infrastructure that has been provided by private development. User rates, obviously key source. This is being an enterprise fund, but also potentially looking at the SIP funding as well. The program, in addition to the capital costs, obviously you need to continue to operate and maintain the system. It's my understanding, talking with Brian and team, that there won't be significant changes to operation and maintenance costs as a result of these improvements. So it's not like you're going to need lots more staff or changes in chemicals, electricity costs. So we are inflating operation and maintenance costs based on current trends, economic conditions, things like that. Really, this cash flow is very much dominated by this capital program. And so the capital financing strategy is key. And so what I'm going to present tonight is this framework that has some base assumptions that are carry in each scenario that we present. And really the idea is just to have this kind of basis for evaluating, looking at differences in the options of how much SIP funding or industrial growth, how that might impact the slope of the line in terms of potential rate increases. It is not a specific rate increase proposal. So I just want to be clear on that. So the revenue slope is the series of rate increases. And again, it's to provide order my idea of time and potential level of increase experiencing. I have, in developing the capital financing plan, I've kind of middle of the road here. There's a lot of uncertainty right now in just terms of general economic conditions, interest rates, inflation. So this, I think, represents a medium case, not a best, not a worst case. And obviously, a program like this of this size is going to be highly sensitive to the specific terms of the whatever kind of debt that you're able to apply here. And so, just take this as this is just a baseline projection. Okay. So starting to look at specific numbers. Sorry, this kind of keeps fading in and out. Swap it out. So the thought at this point is, um, obviously, if there are grants available, that's the best case scenario. But in this sort of medium case, we're looking to maximize flexible, low-cost loans. And the WIFIA funds have been used by a number of communities in Oregon to do these kinds of large-scale generational water system investments. They provide lots of flexibility in terms of the term of the loan, allowing you to stretch it out 35 years, deferral of payments after construction, capitalizing the interest during construction. Interest will accrue, but and that needs to be paid back, but there is some flexibility of when that starts getting paid back. And obviously, deferral of those sorts of costs allows you to ramp up and lower the curve a little bit of the rate increases, allow industrial growth to continue to carry some of the load. And so those sorts of programs can be very attractive in this kind of situation. However, current rates are really high. The WIFIA is tied to the Treasury rates, which are high right now. There were when some of these earlier loan programs and agreements were put in place, they were under 2%. Right now it's over 4%. So there's a lot of uncertainty obviously around that, but everything that I read says rates are going to come down. So as you see it along this path, hopefully the costs of borrowing will continue to moderate. And this will be an attractive program. There are, of course, other options. Like right now, issuing short-term debt in like a commercial paper program is actually, in some cases, more advantageous because that right now has lower rates. And then you convert that to a longer-term debt instrument. The other thing about WIFIA, and this is really key, I think, in your case, when you're considering the SIP, potential use of SIP funds, that you need to provide a local match for the funds. Generally, it's a 49-51 split. We have been told, and it's in their literature, that they, for small communities, will provide funds up to 80%. And so that 20%, that needs to come from some combination of user fees and perhaps, in your case, the SIP funds. Again, having that match will again allow some other sort of longer term financing instrument to be delayed, and the associated interest costs with that be lower over the life of the debt. So this table takes the CIP in 2024 dollars, adds an inflation factor, which is significant when you're talking about a 20-year plan, and then breaks it up into the first cut at trying to make this thing pencil out. And so we've used the WIFIA loan for, I think, basically the treatment plant, the transmission line, and some other projects that could be potentially linked as part of this package. And then you'll need, again, for that match, some other kind of debt, which right now I've got programmed for 2031. That is assuming that there is some SIP funding that comes earlier on, and I'll show you the projected spend down and why that's important. Further out in the plan, 2040 is when the Crow Creek Dam work is projected, and so that's what that additional debt would be focused on. So you can see in blue the numbers that translate to needing to be covered by local revenue sources, and that is that there are other CIP projects that aren't part of that loan or the revenue bonds. You are limited to how much debt you can leverage. You do need to pay for some things out of cash to meet certain requirements of your existing debt and also of issuing new debt. Generally, there's some requirements for generating some level of debt service coverage over and above just paying for operation and maintenance and debt service. Having those other cash funded pay as you go projects helps to make sure that, you know, you can repay the debt and you could always take from those planned projects if you needed to. So it provides some added security. So the big projects though are assumed to be heavily financed, 75-76%, and then pipe replacement and some of that ongoing repair replacement kind of projects would be cash funded. Okay, let's go to the next slide.
Wait, before you,
Yeah.
so if I understand this, it's a total project is with inflation is 263 million.
Mhm.
And then it assumes that we get a loan that with WIFIA, as you call it,
Yes.
loan
Yes,
for 135 million,
correct.
which is now how did you assume that amount?
Yeah, so that's based on the total WIFIA project bundle. We spent some time talking about what projects may qualify and what could be bundled together as part of a loan. And then basically took 80% of that because we're assuming that you'll qualify for the small community maximum loan amount of 80%.
Okay, so you think it's highly likely that we would qualify for that?
That is our hope. And I don't know, Brian, if you want to say anything more about that, but
Yeah, that's our understanding from EPA. I mean, you meet the small community definition. And so there's no reason why that wouldn't be expected. It's a pretty flexible program. The EPA has a lot of latitude. They want to loan dollars. So I don't think that would be a challenge.
Okay, and then the 2031 revenue bond, the 31 million. So we would issue a revenue bond under this scenario in 2031.
yeah, and I'll if we go to the next slide, I think that'll make
Oh.
a little more sense to you. So what and then we can come back to talk more about that. So this chart, a lot going on, but it is the red line and the dots represent that is the cash flow requirements for the CIP. And so you'll see that it kind of, you know, steps up a little bit the first few years, such that you could potentially, with SIP funding and revenue from rates, pay for those things while you're further evaluating capital financing, getting your program set up. Then you've assumed that the WIFIA funds, which is kind of that yellowish color, would start rolling in, and the SIP initially would provide enough at $3 million to pay for that 20% match, that plus the rates. And that would allow you to delay issuing a revenue bond or some other type of instrument to meet the match of the much larger projects. Because again, under the WIFIA, you have to, for each year of the construction, you have to come up with 20% of the funds from something else. And so the extent that you have local sources that can provide that, at a certain point for the magnitude of the projects we're talking about, you're going to need something else big, some influx of money, some other lending instrument.
So is that the capitalized interest?
No, the revenue bond is just to pay for that 20% of that 3 years of projects that are over $100 million. And you need to pay for 20% of that is our understanding based on the WIFIA requirements. So the idea is that, these financing mechanisms work together to fully fund the program, reliance on WIFIA to the full extent possible, if that proves to be the most advantageous program as interest rates change over time. And obviously you would, you need to initiate that process, begin that exploration it requires a letter of interest and then, understanding more about what they would offer and confirmation that that funds would be available. So, but for the purposes of this exercise, I think this is the most likely scenario and provided a way to look at the program with again, use of the SIP funds early on to really help defer when you have to issue that longer term debt. Because once you issue that revenue bond debt, unlike the WIFIA, which, as I said, you accrue interest as you draw funds for the construction, but you don't have to start paying it back right away. The revenue bond, some other kind of instrument like that, as soon as you issue those funds, you've got debt service. You can do some interest only for a couple of years, or, there are some creative ways that you can look to reduce that. But the WIFIA program is much more flexible in terms of pushing out as long as you can to help, match your cash flow needs and moderate near-term rate increases.
Okay, so the total project is 263 according to this scenario.
We go back.
135 million and change would come from the loan. 31 million would come from the 2031 revenue bond, and 17.5 million would come from a 2040 revenue bond. And assuming interest rates, which are, who knows what they're going to be, but your debt service on the loan would be $6 million a year.
Correct. Well, because 6 billion based on the 2024 dollars. And I only showed it with and without inflation because I know you had seen some previous numbers that hadn't included inflation, but they were based on much lower interest rate. And so, yeah, inflation, in my world, you just have to sort of look at the inflation numbers because that's going to be a better estimate of what you're really going to pay in those dollars. But when you're trying to do comparisons to things today, it's not so helpful.
Okay, and the debt service on the 31 bond revenue bond is $1.5 million a year, according to the assumptions. And the debt service on the 2040 revenue bond would be 700,000 a year. So if you add the three together, that's in the blue, $8.2 million of total debt service.
That's right.
Okay.
Now you may, do SRF, a state revolving fund loan. There are other things to look at, obviously, as you're moving forward. Right now, we just have to make some basic assumptions to work with.
Okay, and so the total for the three is 183.7 million. And then if you take that and you subtract that from the 263 million, that leaves 79.3 million,
Exactly.
which we need to come up with, notwithstanding the loan and the two bonds.
Correct. That is for pipe replacement, just other distribution projects, everything else other significant amount of improvements that are in that 20-year.
Okay, and so the average per year of 4 million, is that 79 divided by 20? Yeah. 20 years.
Correct. This is that's over the 20-year life. Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions on this table before we move on?
It's a confirmation for me, but the 2031 and 2040 timelines are based on that $3 million assumption on the next page. So
Exactly.
the subsequent illustrations,
Yeah.
those examples, we'd have different dates for those.
Yes, that's exactly right. And in fact, I have a graph. If you go to the next one. Okay, so this assumes 1 million in SIP funds, and you see all of a sudden now we have to move up to 2026, I think, a revenue bond to provide for the local match. So you can see right away that as 27, 28, there's another dark blue box, and that's because with 1 million SIP funding, if we don't want to do a dramatic rate increase, then you're going to need to issue some other kind of debt to provide that match in the interim. Yeah. So that's exactly what's happening there. Okay. Go on to the next.
Actually, if you don't mind, let's go. Lost me somewhere for a moment. Go back to the sort of the principled table there. I don't have a page number, but I think you know what I'm talking about. The preliminary capital financing strategy table. We have two sums that we need to come up with locally. We have an 8 or a 10 million inflated and a 3 or a 4. Are those, explain that to me again. Are those stacked? Do we need to come up with both of those?
Yes.
So we need to come up with $14 million a year.
Yes. Over the, this is taking the sum total.
Yeah.
And, so over the average life, but as Brian said, it's front loaded in the first 10 years. So, but with the WIFIA, the revenue bonds are pretty much at the year that debt is issued or the next year, you're paying something towards that, whether it's interest or interest in principal. Whereas WIFIA, even though we have that in the first 10 years being drawn, you don't start paying that back to the second 10 years. And how much of a deferral that is really will depend on, the actual loan terms. But it's my understanding that up to 5 years after construction is when that can be delayed. So yes, these are large sums of money to build capacity somewhere in the system for some combination of rates, continued SIP funding. So initially, as I showed, the SIP funding could provide cash funding towards projects to meet match. And then once the big construction gets done, provide part of the debt service payment. Then, rate increases, revenue growth just from customer growth, most pronounced in terms of industrial. Any other questions on this table?
Yeah, the four numbers, which add up to the 263, what went into deciding how much went into each of those four categories? That's where I'm a little fuzzy.
Well-
Why is the loan on 135? Why isn't it 200? And why isn't the revenue amount higher and that one's lower? I mean, how did you?
Yeah. Well, there's not just one way to do this. We met several times as a team to talk about what projects would most likely be eligible for this type of funding. And there's a bunch of criteria that I'm not as familiar with,
Loan.
but for the loan, yes. And, that they're somewhat connected and they meet the criteria with you. So that was where the 100, and I'm going to talk about the inflated dollars. That's where the 169 million number came up with. That was from the team determining what the most likely funding package could be. And then we took 80% of that. That represents the maximum. And then the revenue bonds are kind of the filler of when do we have to issue something else to meet the match or to fund other projects that aren't part of the package. Because that's the higher cost, less flexible debt. But being debt, it allows you to spread the costs out over the life of the projects as opposed to having that cash funding. Cash funding of the 70% debt versus cash, that is kind of standard financial, practices of, working with those kind of metrics. Could you leverage more? Perhaps, if you have full faith and credit backing of the city and you don't have to meet the debt service coverage requirement, you can push that higher and reduce that local pay-as-you-go component. These are all the pieces, many, many variables. We've tried to, again, medium case capital financing that we thought was a solid plan to start to talk about how you might fund this program.
So the total of $263 million, 169 million or what you would consider be eligible for a loan. But the loan requirements require 80%. You can't go the full 100%. So
Correct.
80% of 169 million is $135.2 million.
Correct.
And if I may, Mr. Mayor, just a clarification question for me. So that you mentioned 80% for a smaller community, but you had also mentioned a 51-49 split is kind of the more typical approach. And so 135 is 135.2 is approximately 51.4% of 263. That's not relevant there.
Correct. Right. Yeah. Yeah. That is
A
a
coincidence.
coincidence.
Interesting.
It
coincidence.
is.
Yeah, it's pretty close.
Good math, though.
Yeah, if I can, Deb, the city manager and I had been talking about this for a while, and the preliminary information that we were talking about before was this 49-51% funding for the WIFIA program. Since then, we found out that for small communities, I believe that small communities is 25,000. So different than some other federal funding programs, which only apply to communities less than 10,000. This one defines a small community as anything under 25,000 population. So we qualify for that. So the thing that's changed since our preliminary conversations is we're now talking about being able to get 80% WIFIA loan funding instead of just the 49% I had previously shared.
The other thing I'll add, just to respond to how did we break these up, we tried to focus on the larger projects that were all within a group time frame. Federal loan programs are great. It is borrowing federal dollars, so it invites processes you wouldn't normally have to deal with. So we didn't want to throw everything in. Buy American Steel is required. The BOLI requirements change in terms of meeting Davis-Bacon requirements. It opens you up to a NEPA process, which while it's streamlined for WIFIA, it's still a national environmental permitting process. And so there's added administrative costs associated with projects that wouldn't necessarily make sense for some of the smaller projects. So we tried to leave those out and really focus on the ones where that large loan program benefits you because of the total project cost.
These are requirements. These are requirements that we just had to adhere to for the Dog River Pipeline and its funding. So, the city's got some experience dealing with these types of requirements on larger projects.
Any other questions on this?
On the two scenarios, the 3 million or the 1 million SIP, what would cause that reduction?
Well, Dave told me to do a floor and a ceiling.
Yeah, so those were provided as different alternatives since we're having a conversation, or the council's having conversations and trying to make decisions around how to use that SIP funding. So we've just presented a couple of different scenarios. By the time we get to the end of the presentation, I think you'll be able to have some sort of a feel for what the impact on user rates are going to be, for example, between those two different scenarios. And then we're hoping that, council gives us some direction as far as, well, we like one option, we don't, or we prefer a different option. And so the two different scenarios were just presented as alternatives for evaluation and understand those impacts.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so yeah, let's stop here. So now this cash flow projection is looking at sort of the operating side. So now the last two graphs, they were talking about, how we're going to fund the capital costs, the debt service and the construction costs each year, and that the rates we're going to need to contribute to some of that to provide that what's not covered by the debt, and then to pay for the debt service once that's completed. This shows the no inflation version of the operating projections. So in this case, the purple is the operation and maintenance costs. And as I said, no significant changes to staffing or other base level O&M costs are anticipated. So that's kind of just flatlined. And what really happens here is that growing of the capital piece. So the turquoise is the transfer to the construction fund to pay for, initially to pay for some of the projects and then to pay for debt service. This, and I've included at the top in tiny little font, the rate increases that would be associated with slope of that line. And you could see with no inflation and the 3 million, this is 3 million SIP. We've got three, variables here: SIP funding, industrial growth, high or low, and inflation on or off. This is inflation off, low industrial growth, but 3 million in SIP funding. So that in the first 10 years, again, because the plan is front loaded, that and starting from where you are, which with very little in the current rates to fund capital, the line is just going to have to be steeper if you go forward with the planned phasing of the projects. Then it kind of flattens out as you get in the second, because you've got to build capacity to be able to pay for the debt service once wherever it is going to be on this line, and that will be dependent on the loan agreement. But this, again, just gives you some sense of, without inflation, just a base level 4% increase. And, the national statistics on rates have shown for years, last decade or two, that because we are behind as an industry in our replacement of our systems, that rates need to increase at 2 times the level of inflation. So this is basically showing that is you need to have base level increase, fund those capital projects, and then we add on inflation to that. We'll go to the next slide. So this one is high industrial growth, which is a good thing for revenue. And but then we add on the inflation, which again, crystal ball here, use 3.5% as kind of an overall average. But actually we've assumed, different rates for different types of costs, but it works out to be something like 3%. So in this case, the industrial growth helps to offset the, but not completely do away with the impacts of the inflation. So in this case, the slope increases from 4% to 5.5% in that first period. And it's quite a bit flatter though, because we've assumed this higher industrial growth.
When you say higher industrial growth, what effect does that have exactly on, because that would increase our property taxes, but that wouldn't help this, but.
It's water sales, revenue.
So the growth
In the sales of,
okay, does that include, or assume Google?
yes. That's,
Okay,
and
It's going to be largely a function of how fast the facilities that are currently under construction ramp up. We've seen from the existing data centers, that they may operate at a lower rate for the first several years of their service life. And then that ramps up over time. They start to use more water. They start to use more power as they use more of their capacity at this new facility. We've actually worked with them in the development of this plan and gotten from them their best estimates of what they think their ramp up rate's going to be. And then we've tried to bracket that. And so on the previous scenario where Deb outlined low industrial growth, that's where we've assumed that they're going to ramp up pretty slowly, very gradually over at least that first 10 years. This higher industrial growth assumes they're going to ramp up faster. So
Sorry,
that's
Dave,
what we're talking about when we say high industrial or low industrial growth.
sorry, clarify for me, which one did they say was more likely? The low?
The higher growth is the one that they
Is more- sorry.
supported. Yep. And that reflects development to the full amount in the development agreement.
So it's fair to say that this assumption for high industrial growth, whether it's the first scenario or the second, is 100% due to Google? And without any other industrial growth other than them?
No, you also had some development of the vacant
yeah.
lands within UGB.
Yeah, it's inclusive of all of the potential industrial growth, Google being the largest, but there is the potential for additional development in the industrial sector that is included in this, both the low and high scenarios.
So it looks to me like if what you say is going to happen with Google, they are in essence paying for a large share of the capital improvements because of their increased water use.
Correct. The more, and you'll see more of it as Deb goes on, but the more significant industrial growth that occurs, the more that they will offset the total cost of the improvements and pay a larger portion of it.
Which would lessen the impact on residential and industrial users, the
Correct.
others.
Okay. Next slide, and then we've got 1 million SIP, high industrial growth, 3.5% inflation. So here the line, the slope goes from 5.5% to 7.5%. So again, very significant in terms of SIP funds having an impact on keeping the slope of that line and the rate increases down. Okay.
When you say 3 million in SIP funding, what
Per year.
per year?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And the other scenario you have is $1 million per year.
Yeah. And of course, it could be somewhere in between that. Just wanted to give kind of a high and a low.
That's over,
Based on-
that's a 20-year.
Or again, it could be nothing depending on councils. It
Yes.
could be more than we just ran
Yeah.
scenarios for the 1 and 3 for
Yeah.
explanatory purposes.
Is it accurate or not accurate to use the 5% or the 4% or the whatever 7.5% as like a rough ballpark of what non-industrial rates, water rates would have to go up as well?
Yeah, so the revenue slope, those little dots and those numbers represent what the general rate increase would need to be, which would apply to all customers. At this section of the presentation just says, just assume it's across the board. In the next section, we'll talk about are each customer class paying its fair share, and could that be shifted more to one or another class? Right here, this is just represents applied total to all customers.
Which shows that we could spend a whole lot of SIP money and just turn the dial up a couple of percent per year.
Per year.
All right, thank you.
And the next slide then gets looking at the actual bills. So again, this is based on the medium case capital funding strategy, the current rate structure. So that means the current, how costs are being incurred by different classes. And then puts the current bill, same in all scenarios. Then you've got high, low industrial growth and high, low SIP. I've used 1 million as the low, but as Dave said, that could be 0. And then the 3 million. And so you can see that in 2040, so 2040 is when the big three, when the WIFIA project construction is anticipated to be completed. Debt service is being part of the requirements, and you're continuing to fund those other projects. So it's kind of a in this plan represents kind of a peak in when the revenue requirements. So you can see that the high industrial growth definitely reduces the bills significantly, as does the SIP. Inflation, unfortunately, adds about 55%, as the numbers that we've used hopefully translate into that. But the the higher industrial growth results in an 18-20% reduction in the bill that's forecast for the 2040. And similarly, the SIP funding, 3 million versus 1 million, 15 to 20% in that out year.
If we were to assume that inflation is a reality, it would be irresponsible of us not to include some kind of inflation.
Correct.
But if we, let's say we underestimated and with the goal of trying to keep costs down, and then let's say we said, well, let's use 2% instead of 3.5%, but it turned out to be 4%, that we would be short of, under the planning scenario, we'd be short of funds in 2031, for example. And
Yes,
Yeah.
and it gets much more painful when you have to try to make up for,
Right.
lost. If you smooth the rates, that's why those lines are as flat as they can be and smooth as they can be. Taking little bites of the apple each year helps to avoid that rate shock of going with some sort of double-digit increase, which many communities had to do in response to the high inflationary period that we just had. But yeah, it's always good to plan for some level of inflation and modify as information becomes available. So these rates, the 2024 rates, I included those in those 2040 numbers. So we could show you just some other communities who have also undergone major water system expansion. And you can see in the next slide some of those rates as compared to your rates without inflation. Because obviously, if we include the inflation in your rates, and these are what these communities are paying today, then it's an apples to oranges comparison. So these are not, while they are significant increases, they are not out of line with what other communities are paying today after having gone through or in the process of doing major capital construction in the water system.
how did you come to pick those 5?
Again, the team talked about who's doing projects, and I read the news, and I live in Washington County, and I know a lot of, well, I'm a ratepayer for one thing of TBWD and Tualatin Valley Water District, and seeing, well, Portland has got the water filtration plant, which is a WIFIA project. And they have been touting how that project is helping save ratepayers money. I know Beaverton has WIFIA money for the Washington County supply line. So all similar large, difficult construction projects and hard to finance. But yeah, so we thought it was kind of an apples to apples. More, it's always hard to do comparisons, but at least we wanted to show communities that are having these generational investments.
It's the 6.0 and the 9.0 across the top. Sorry, is that 6,000?
Oh, sorry. 6,000
9,000
gallons.
gallons.
Yeah. So that's showing a sample bill.
Yeah.
At those levels. And it's important as we get into the next discussion about the quantity allowance, because your rates, other communities, as you ramp up in your consumption, your bill goes up pretty significantly, which you can see here. Whereas in your case right now, it's flat. Show those two. Okay. All right. So we've made it through subsection 1 of the financial analysis. Just to summarize, you've got significant rate increases are going to be needed to grow the rate capacity to fund this greater than $200 million CIP over the next 20 years and keep pace with inflation. Further evaluation of capital financing options will better define what the true rate impacts are. And it's a policy issue but something's coming. And so when to start, that is a policy decision, and how much. And as you have these conversations about SIP, which is another policy decision, that will help inform then what you should maybe start planning for in terms of the water rate increase.
We don't expect to get the SIP revenues for 2 more years.
It all depends on when the data centers get their certificate of occupancy and start functioning.
And you understood that when you did the scenarios, right? Yeah.
Yeah, we took the conservative approach in when the SIP monies might be coming in. I'm somewhat optimistic we might be able to do better than the conservative approach we've presented here. They might come in a year sooner, I guess is what I'm saying, than we've assumed.
The those 5 communities that you cited here, let's take Hillsborough for example. A resident who uses 6,000 gallons a month in Hillsborough pays $50.34 a month. Is that
Yes.
now? Is that with all the improvements and the increase in the rates and all that stuff, or is?
I'm quite sure that they have additional rate increases. Most agencies are doing the smoothing, trying to phase in rate increases, and where they are along their path of increases, I don't know. I just pulled the most current rates.
I mean, I would think that this is going on all over the country.
Oh, for sure.
And
For sure.
the improvements that are needed are significant everywhere. Yeah.
Many of these have undergone 7, 8, 9% rate increases, at least in the last year or.
This question may be a little too in the weeds, but Hillsborough is home to Intel. Does that play a role there for that community, like it could play here in a similar fashion?
Very well could. I know that we did actually look at their rates and because they did a rate study recently too to see what they had if they had made modifications to their industrial rates. And one thing that they did certainly was to increase the fixed charges on the industrial customers, and we can talk more about that as part of the rate structure stuff. But yeah, all those I'm sure are factors.
And you may know more about this than I do, but I remember talking to the manager at the time of the Hillsborough Water Utility, and they saw that industrial development coming and had the SDC conversation before those big developments moved in and allocated their SDC burden accordingly just before Intel was, getting their permits and paying their SDC. So that was part of their conversation 10 or 15 years ago.
This is not something we need right away, but I am curious if we wanted a larger rate study. Is that a service that LOC might provide for us? Matthew?
Well, I may defer to Dave. LOC has a number of times they put out a variety of different surveys. I'm not sure maybe when the last one they did.
We're going to see some slides here in a little bit that compare us with much more utilities than on there. And you might recall that we provided some of that information also back in April. I would offer my opinion that a rate study has some limited value other than to show if you're completely out of the range of reality, because each utility has an obligation or just a need to fulfill its own needs, and those are unique, amongst each utility. A lot of utilities got federal funding that was available in the 70s. And so they aren't at their end of life. They're looking at expansions or upgrades where we're looking at a plant that was built in 1949 as a replacement. So it gets difficult just to look at comparing what other utilities are charging.
Oh, I think our
rates
fellow
and-
residents are going to do that just fine.
Absolutely, absolutely. And like I
Be
said, we're
nice
going
to
to have
have
some
that.
information that I think will be helpful towards that understanding.
Thank you. I appreciate the complexity of the topic involved, and yet we can anticipate or lead the target a little bit with some of our neighbors maybe.
Oh, and I did want to, before we go to this next piece, is mention about the SDCs. I'm glad you brought that up, Dave. So we have completed the estimating, what might be SDC eligible of that 200 million plus plan. And as Brian said, a lot of this is replacement kind of infrastructure, but it is being built with capacity to accommodate future growth as well. And roughly 50% of the cost is potentially SDC eligible, though I should say some of that capacity already has a claim on it, and that is from the current industrial customers. And we will be completing the update of the SDC fees and bringing that to council for discussion about then determining what you want to charge going forward. The thing about the SDCs is it's potentially a large amount of money over the life of that capacity, which is 50 years plus. From a financial standpoint, when the engineers do their work to determine when the improvements are needed and how large they need to be, they have to be conservative that growth may happen sooner rather than later. When we look at the financials, we assume kind of the opposite, that things are going to go slow. And because again, you need to have the money to pay for it, regardless of whether that growth appears. So yes, SDCs will continue to be a funding option, and hopefully you can grow that piece to again offset some of or that bar a little bit, but it's not going to have anywhere near the order of magnitude impact like the SIP or the industrial growth. So just managing expectations there, but we're not forgetting that piece, and we will bring that back.
Or we move to the next piece, just because we are at about an hour and a half. Mr. Mayor, would you like to take a break, or you like us to keep rolling?
Keep going.
Oh, I'm gonna have to take off. I've got to work all night tonight. But I've got a couple of things I would add for your deliberations later on as far as what I'm hearing. One is our PIO sitting over there behind her computer. She's gonna have a lot of work to do. The community is gonna be very confused about this scenario in light of all the stories you're seeing right now are about wads of money coming into the community. We need to be getting some stories out about these WICs, about Crow Creek and the other things down the line that don't go into all the details necessarily at this point, but just that these are old and are going to need work, and get that storyline going out there to the public and not just the other, here comes the money kind of thing. I have doubts about any significant amount of money going to endowments with the county. We may have to do something there, but that's where I'm really held back on that because of these expenses we've been hearing about. I think we need to, I don't know what the timeline is when you look at rates and like that, but I think rates need to start being adjusted sooner than later. It's not something we can just put off for another year and then pop it in there. I think we need to start talking about that and the reasons for it to the public, just being transparent. We also need to reevaluate, and I think you're going to talk about it, increases by category, and how they're not all going to be even, Steven, in that regard.
Could you repeat that sentence?
What's that?
Could you just repeat that what you just said?
Reevaluating the rate increase, possible need for rate increases by category. And I think that's really important. But the public relations campaign to be transparent about all that's on the table, not all these costs yet, because a lot of them we're still guessing, right? But we need to start getting that story out there about the history of those facilities, Crow Creek, Wicks, and the others down the line. I mean, like, way. We don't have any news people here tonight. I don't see anybody listening, but I think that's a big public relations need that we need to get involved in. And with that, I'm going to excuse myself. Enjoy the rest of your.
Appreciate your comments, and I agree with everything you said. I do feel, and I know we got a lot to go through here still, but I think we ought to think about a rate increase sooner rather than later, as Rod said. And I will say too that our last joint meeting with the county, Tom Peterson wrote a very, very good article about the results of that meeting, and it's in here. It's mentioned in the article about the need for the water system improvements. And I will point out too that in the community survey, infrastructure was, I think, second or third on the list of community needs, community wants, et cetera. So, and I have a copy of the article here if anybody wants to see it.
Well, this next piece is addresses one of the issues that came up, was raised about looking at the cost by category. So just as a reminder of your current rate structure is got two customer classes, residential and commercial. Commercial includes industrial currently. And there are two components, a volume and a fixed monthly charge. The fixed monthly charge includes a large quantity allowance for residential customers and lower quantity for. These rates have been in effect since 2014. So this chart shows you the current revenue generated and received from the different customer classes, the percent of the total. So, but you know, the rate structure again is base rate each month per customer. So customers contribute towards the cost recovery is a function of how many customers there are in each class times that base rate and the quantity that is billable under that applied to the volume rate. Industrial customers, 5,000 gallons a month doesn't matter much. They're using some quantities well in excess of that. It does matter for some small commercial, and it certainly matters for residential. But you can see that currently the split is about 50%, close to 50% is residential, and then the industrial growth. So even if you didn't make any changes to the rate structure or adjustment to that unit pricing, as was suggested, you know, for just shifting costs, industrial is projected to grow to be somewhere between 42 and 50% of the total revenue by 2040. You know, that's kind of the two options looking at in terms of those industrial growth. So they will continue to pay a larger portion of the revenue, but the pie is increasing, right? So it doesn't mean that, as we've seen, you still need general rate increases, even though if they're paying a larger share based on just total volume sold. So cost of service analysis that we've done and have preliminary findings for, it considers, in addition to just the growing volume, are there other pricing considerations that the unit price should change for any of the customer classes to reflect other considerations, and we'll talk about what those other considerations are. One thing before you move that, so you know, we have, as you can see in this chart, for the purposes of this analysis, preliminary analysis, we have broken out industrial from commercial. We did that so that we could further explore that and the user characteristics and the cost of service. It became a challenging exercise to draw that line because there are a lot of customers that you could say, well, they're doing kind of an industrial manufacturing thing, but they're not really large. So then we started looking at, well, where are they located? And we came up with this definition of, you know, a significant customer that's located in the 310 pressure zone in a area zoned as industrial and uses water for manufacturing or cooling processes. So I think that captures it pretty well. And you'll see, it will present the results of this. This is an option. We can also combine that, continue to keep that as a combined class It's really a policy decision. And so I just wanted to be clear on that. I'll get into a little bit of the detail just to demonstrate that this was a very comprehensive look at how the utility incurs costs and what are those factors that go into sizing the system, and then once the facilities are there, operating and maintaining those. So, and while it's very specific to your system, looking at your peaking factors of how much of your demand is driven by peak hour or peak day, fire flow needs, we're also following accepted industry practices for how we determine and, these buckets and define those costs. These categories, we look at the average demand, that's just annual demand. So, again, industrial customers use lots of water, so they pay for proportionately more just by the fact that they are using more. Peak demand gets at the sizing of facilities that have to be available to meet those demands. There is capacity in the reservoirs, and there's got to be pumping capacity for emergency and fire use, and that's a significant cost of pumping and storage. And the distribution system is much of its size to deliver fire flows. And then there are just costs that are related to servicing meters and billing and customer service. So those are the categories. ASR, so this is something specific to your system, serves customers in that zone 310. So we've looked at that as a separate category and allocated costs to customers in proportion to what portion of their demand is in that zone. Okay. Oh, and we have taken in, to account, there is some private storage of customers. So that gets factored into the mix as well. Just because this might be of interest, and it's, I think, helpful to understand the findings in the end when we present that, is that about 2/3 of the cost has been estimated to relate to average or peak demand, and peak demand has the highest, just slightly above average demand as in terms of a cost factor, because so much of the system is sized for that maximum day demand. And so customers who require that more of that extra capacity, they get allocated costs in proportion. And then you can see that, the other percentages there. Okay. So looking at the customer class peaking requirements, see the three classes. Industrial has the lowest. Commercial and residential are fairly even. Commercial includes government accounts, so there are institutional parks, schools with significant irrigation. That's why residential has the higher peaking factor that it does, is because of outdoor irrigation. Okay, next slide. This just shows the graphs, just so you can see side by side. For example, residential and industrial, you can see that they use a lot of water for, relatively few number of customers, but it's more even than, has a lower peak than residential and commercial. So, okay. And we do look at multiple years of data so that we're not just kind of looking at a single year where the weather might have been different or customer demands were different. And so this next slide shows you kind of the side by side of what customers are paying now based on the current rate structure and what they would be under the revised cost of service. Interestingly, I thought the blue, which is the residential bar, it declined even under the current rate structure because again, more of the volume is anticipated to be sold to industrial customers. The cost of service, though, does suggest that some shifting away of costs from residential, but not in this case to industrial specifically, but to commercial. And so there is, a shift that see what those percent of the totals are in the bars, but commercial revenue increase is about 10% as a result of this analysis. Industrial is about 4%, and residential is a decrease of about 9%. So yes, there is some opportunity to not apply those rate increases across the board to all classes, but to have a higher percent increase to non-residential customers, either keep them as a single class and come up with a composite rate, or to have them as individual separate classes.
If I may, I've seen a couple of puzzled looks, Counselor Long.
No, I just read ahead and I'm.
Oh, so anyway, but I think to me originally it was a little bit counterintuitive that the peaking factor was so much more for residential customers than industrial. And I came to realize, I mean, they're operating their industry year round. So they're using a lot of water in the winter and they're just using some more in the summer. Where the residential customers, they're not doing any outdoor irrigation in the summer. So you're going from just using a few thousand gallons in the winter, although, they're allowed 10, to something significantly, 2.7 or 2.8 times greater than that in the summer due to the outdoor irrigation. And so that's why some of that cost allocation didn't end up turning out the way I was expecting it to, where less of it got driven to the industrial customers just because of that peaking factor was a lower number than it is for the commercial and residential classes.
And again, we will bring, if, council desires, we'll bring an option of just keeping that non-residential class as one and, not separating out that we wanted to explore that to make sure that we were leaving no stone unturned in terms of evaluating fair and equitable cost. Those industrial rates also reflect the fact that there is some private storage that is maintained, or city maintains it, but was constructed by industrial customer. And so we have, these are the factors that we take into account when we look at those costs. That was a kind of a minor issue, but again, it was an issue that we. Okay.
Sorry. So why are we going down the peaking? Is this just an exercise in looking at equitable distribution? Yeah. All right.
Yeah, it was, part of the desire was to make sure that each customer class was paying its fair share. And there was some increase for industrial. It just that it was not as high as the increase that for other non-residential. So, putting those grouping them back together may, then actually probably will increase the rate for industrial rather than keeping them separate. Just have that be, and again, part of it is because it's a difficult thing to really identify who's industrial and who's commercial. So those are options, but we, again, following the standard accepted practices of how we look at this and having multiple workshops of understanding how the system is designed and constructed. That's what we came up with.
Well, clearly I'm a layperson, but I'm not sure I'm entirely interested in perfectly equitable price structure. I'm interested more just as guy off the street who's been elected to represent a bunch of other people off the street or on the street who live in town. I think quality of life considerations may be, to me, just as important or more important than perfectly equitable price structure.
Well, I think again, it's important to look at that slide or the one that has the bars that show that industrial is going to pay significantly contribute more towards the system cost as they continue to use more water. So they are increasing their share, their portion of the revenue. So it was a question of, is there another increment that we should be considering to modify the unit price? And the results were, yes, there is some capacity to do that within the framework of the cost of service. But cost of service, kind of is a benchmark. It is not, again, you don't have to have separate customer classes. You can find commercial and industrial, do whatever is the practice that is going to achieve the balance your cost recovery goals. It's something we part of what we are doing as part of this plan. So anything else on that, Dave, that you wanted to add? All right. In the interest of time, I'll move on to the rate structure options, which is the last component of the presentation. So the questions here, I think, are the primary policy questions. So this assumes that, once you get to what's the class, how much revenue are you recovering from that customer class? How do you want to recover it from customers within the class? So on the table here for options are eliminating or reducing the minimum quantity that's included in the base charge. Currently 10,000 gallons for residential, 5,000 for non-residential. So we're presenting an option that reduces residential to 7,500 gallons and eliminates the quantity for non-residential, since non-residential customers tend to use quite a bit more. Modifying the rates to align with the cost of service. So got an option that shows what the rates would be under that scenario. And, then of course, for the council discussion is, how to, align this, integrate this with the general rate increase that, is
If I might, Deb, just before we leave this slide, in the first bullet there, the options to reduce the amount of water included in the base rate. I want to provide just a little bit of context on that. First of all, for the residential customers, we include 10,000 gallons or up to 10,000 gallons of the base rate. That's extremely unusual for a water utility to do that. And I'm not sure we know of anybody else that does that, or at least includes that much water. And it really came home to me as being an issue for us for the city when I was applying for funding for the Dog River project. We used funds called the Safe Drinking Water Revolving Loan Fund, which is federal money, and it's competitive. There were two different rates, sets of loan terms that were available. One was the terms that are available to everybody, which was a 20-year loan, and I believe the interest was like 2.6%. And if we were able to demonstrate that we charged enough for our water and already had skin in the game, if it was, were economically distressed on terms of water rates, we could qualify for the 30-year loan at 1% interest, which was what we ultimately got. But it became a very challenge, and it was a conversation that went on for nearly 2 months before I was able to get that, because we included more than 7,500 gallons in our base rate. I can't guarantee that, if the city was pursuing similar funding in the future, that they would be successful to get in that conversation. So for that factor alone, I think there's a case to be made that it's worth considering reducing that amount that's included in the base rate for down to 7,500 gallons. The other thing is we've heard over time from customers that they want a little bit more control over their water bill. If they're not using 10,000 gallons, they don't want to pay for 10,000 gallons. So just two issues related to that particular issue that we'll be seeking some direction on.
Where'd the 7,500 come from?
7,500 is just the state and federal's assumption of how much an average residential water bill is over the course of a year. So that was their number, not ours. And we just are matching it to align with the funding criteria.
Do we have other communities and what they're? Maybe we could survey some other communities.
Oh, yeah, and we have, I've got some information on that. There are very few that include quantity allowances, but where they do, there's two in the information we'll share. It's much lower. It's a 5,000 gallon well.
Tim?
I understand our goal is to create a fair and equitable cost structure. I'm curious, historically, why did we choose a rate structure like this? And how long has it been used?
So, we went to billing on the meters. We installed meters in 1991 through 1993. I'm going to give you the history lesson, but I'll be trying to read. We started billing on them in 1994. Deb was actually involved in working with the city, I believe, at that time. And there was a desire initially to get as much conservation out of the billing on the meters as we could, and we had an increasing block rate, and if water got more expensive, more used, and we didn't keep that very long. There was a lot of concern raised around that, and we went to a uniform rate, and the council at that time, I believe, included 15,000 gallons in that base rate, and the goal or their intent was they didn't want to make or incentivize a brown community. They wanted to give people enough water that they thought they could do a minimum amount of irrigation and keep the community looking good. I don't remember the exact year, but in a subsequent, it might have been with the 2006 Water Master Plan, that base rate quantity was reduced from 15 to 10.
I remember.
Yeah. And so, and again, the primary justification that I remember hearing is trying to avoid disincentivizing some outdoor irrigation. But if we went from 10,000 to 7,500 and our current unit cost rate, it'd be about $3.50 a month because it's only $1.61 per 1,000 gallons. So another 2,000 gallons on the bill is $3.06 under the current rate. So I think, did that answer your question?
I did on that one, but I have another one. What's the most common rate structure in Oregon then? If we use a residential, commercial, industrial, how do they create a system that's more equitable and fair?
Deb, you might have a lot better.
Well, so it is common to have different customer classes and charge rates accordingly, though there are some who don't differentiate between classes at all, where there are different classes. Residential, commercial, industrial are the most common, or residential and just general service. Some go as far to break out irrigation separately, and other classes. And then in terms of the rate structure, yes, the quantity is going away. The minimum quantity that has gone away in most places already, or been significantly reduced. The trick is that when the quantity goes away, the base rate has to be sufficient to cover enough of your costs to recognize the fact that the majority of costs are fixed. And so when people do use less, you still need to pay bills. So there's always this expectation of, oh, I'm going to have lots of control over my bill and be able to reduce my bill significantly, which some on the margin for sure, but not to the extent of the financial peril of the system. Because it's the availability of the service that we're paying for. And of course, there are, a lot of those communities that I showed you in the bill comparison previously, they have inclining block rates. In fact, I think all of those systems have inclining block rates where the more you use, the more you pay. I'm not a proponent of that for you.
Right.
But yes, reducing the minimum quantity would be a step in the right direction to align with federal.
Mayor Mays,
Oh, sorry.
another. Generally, the federal government is a funding source for high cost infrastructure. I don't see any anticipated federal matching funds in these proposals.
So the WIFIA program is federal money.
But as a loan program, I'm looking at
As a
grant
loan,
programs.
as a loan program, and they, and we'll, right now, there are very few grant programs, if any, available. Not the partnership, for this, the SRF, this revolving fund that we use for Dog River, we were able to get 10% of that loan forgiven. But that's the type of programs we've seen out there. And if I recall correctly, if we use WIFIA, we can't use another federal funding source for the match, right? So we've got to be a little bit careful. We will certainly keep looking for grant opportunities. I mean, that's just kind of a continual thing. But right now, there isn't anything we're aware of that would, come close to this level of funding.
So is that a potential item for outreach team to go back to Washington to seek funding?
I mean, one comment from me, just as an example, is, congressionally directed spending, is an option, but it's no guarantee.
I understand.
And, our partner community over in Hood River has been seeking CDS spending and every source under the sun to help with replacing the Hood River Bridge. And that's a very compelling project because of the bi-state nature of it. It's
Right.
critical nature for transportation. And they still have quite the funding gap that they're trying to work through. So for some of these projects, a CDS request or some other congressionally directed spending for transmission lines, honestly, and I'm just kind of speaking off the cuff, may not be as compelling an ask as what other communities might be facing.
It's something, and Deb identified it early on. It's something we'll continue to look for, obviously.
Right.
And if we're successful, it helps these numbers, right? It would lower this need, but we can't, sit here today with a straight face and tell you that we have our eye on grants that's going to help us very much.
Correct. I also, I'm looking at that 10K minimum use and I was going to ask you, what is the recommended? You said 7,500, so that would lower it down. But I've heard from seniors in our community that they would rather have a lower rate and lower their bills so they have, like you said, more control. And if we come back and we restructure and recreate a plan, maybe to shift some of the burden to commercial or to industrial and maybe to residential, I'm just questioning, I think that would be the direction I'd prefer to go, is looking at ways of restructuring how we're billing our customers.
And I think Deb's going to get to some of that in here real shortly. We're going to touch on some of that.
So that would be my preference, and to minimize the impact on our senior population.
We have, I think Councilor may remember, but we do have rate assistance for low income. It's not strictly age only. I mean, that's not the determiner of how much of a burden paying the water bill is. But if there's a low income element there, we do have rate assistance available at, I think, 10 and 35% levels.
Rates are going up, their rates are going up too.
Oh, yes. Yes.
It's a comment, but Councilor Runyon talked about getting the word out and getting to the radio, television, newspaper, but getting a message out so we prepare the community for rate increases that will be coming, and let them know that we are trying to structure in a fair and equitable, but the costs must be shifted. They must be paid for to get these, to keep us current. And we have to project to the future to protect our community. That's my only comment. No.
And Councilor, if I may, that kind of communication and informing the community is something very much on the radar and something that staff is working on. We also didn't want to get too far ahead of our skis and be communicating a message out there that you weren't informed or part of that conversation first, and we received the direction we've been asking for tonight. So very much on the radar, and this is part of that process.
We don't want to frighten citizens, yet we still need to be truthful and open and let people know what's happening and how it'll affect them and their payments.
Okay, moving right along.
Okay. Yeah, it'd be great if at the end of this last section here that, consider these options and give us specific feedback on other options you'd like to see. So if you'd like to go down to 5 in the minimum or, whatever it is, yeah, and we'll bring back those final options.
Well,
So-
on the next page, I mean, it says approximately 70% of the residential accounts use less than 10,000 and approximately 52% use less than 7.5 gallons. So there's already a lot of room in there, and we have to raise revenue. So reducing the amount people pay is counterintuitive.
That is the flip side. Exactly. It's, if it's always hard when you're doing restructuring at the time where they're going up. And on the one hand, if you reduce the burden on, small users, then as the rates go into effect, they're not hit as hard, but it does then compound on the other end to citizens who, as the rate structure changes and their bills are going up just because the structure change and also because of the general revenue. It's a delicate balance.
Well, politically, we'll hear about the commercial rate increases. Believe me, any kind of changes will result in criticism. And so is how we handle that criticism.
Fair enough, Councillor McLaughlin. I guess I would add that it might be a useful part of the narrative or conversation that we have with people that, not increasing rates for 10 years has been a significant rate cut.
And that is
Maintenance
true.
cost goes up and we've not kept pace. And now we're doing a lot of catch up.
That is
We're
true.
going to have to. We're going to have to do a lot of that.
Yeah, so this just a reminder of, and sort of feeds back to what Dave was saying too, of that kind of that median use being right around there, 7.5, 8, something like that. So there's still, even when we reduce it to 7.5 thousand gallons, there's still a lot of customers using less. But that's the option we're bringing you tonight. And if Brian will. Okay, so the idea here is just to, and there's lots of ways to finance the, assumptions that we could use for the capital financing strategies. There's lots of different ways to design rates. We always say it's an art as much as a science, So again, just starting with looking at some numbers and potential impacts, and then very much wanting your feedback in terms of what other options or you'd like to see. So in this case, when we reduce the minimum or the base rate, or the quantity, we have also reduced the base rate some. This is revenue neutral. This option, it's meant to recover the same amount from the residential customer class as the current rates. So it's reducing the base rate, charging for some additional usage, because there are, people who are using in excess of 7.5 thousand gallons. They will now be charged for what they weren't charged before, between 7.5 and 10. And then so that you pick up a little additional revenue. But when with that reduction in the base rate, then the volume rate would increase. And so the on the left, you see that in dollars, just kind of compares at different usage levels along the bottom, what the bill increase, and you can see the blue and is the current and the red is the revised. The chart on the right shows it in percentage terms. And again, you can see in a revenue neutral scenario, so before any rate increase is layered on, and no shifting of costs assumed in this option to non-residential, that the rate with associated with that kind of a volume rate increase would, you know, for some customers using larger quantities of water, you might see a bill increase of, you know, 20% or something. Most customers over the course of the year would see some decreases in the bills in the winter months, perhaps, and then some increases in the summer months. So show you what the sort of combined that is. So this is the histogram that shows just the number of customers bar represents at different increase levels. And it just shows that, you know, there are on the lower end, those are rate decreases. It's a little confusing because the way the histogram is with brackets, brackets mean both decreases. And so if there's a double bracket, it means it's a decrease. If it's a single bracket, it's an increase. But you can see that there are very few customers out on the bar end when we look at the total annual bill average that would see significant rate increases. Most customers would see a few dollars or in some cases reductions. Now we layer on the revised cost of service. So this is how this works is we, you know, just kind of look with so many potential variables changing, you've got the rate increase, you've got the potential of shifting costs between classes, and then you've got the rate structure change. It gets to be a lot to try to understand. I tried to break those out so you could understand the impacts of each. This just shows that if you were to implement cost of service direction of shifting more cost to non-residential, whether that, you know, that be commercial and industrial combined or individual classes, that would significantly moderate the impacts to residential. And the volume rate in this case is $1.83. The fixed charge is lower and the bill increases would hardly anybody's bill would increase. So you know, those shifts from the cost of service results do have a significant impact for residential, a positive.
Sorry, let me just make sure. It's been a long day. Let
I
me.
agree.
So this chart shows that you would shift the cost of water, the actual dollar, the actual monthly bill for most people, for most residents would go down under a revised 7,500 gallon minimum. Is that right?
So this is 7.5 gallon minimum reduction plus the change, the cost of service implemented all in 1 year.
Right.
We had no rate increase to offset the decrease.
The idea being that we would make up for it and hopefully then some in volume.
Well,
it's so high volume users.
Yeah, that we would be shifting costs over to the other users and not offset. You know, there's a whole separate design around, well, do you just hold the residential rates flat and then not do their increases for a couple of years? So they kind of just sit flat and then let the other, you know, so rather than decreasing somebody's bill, there's that whole discussion about how to integrate the implementation. But this is just showing you that but the previous slide showed just the impact of the 7.5 going from 10 to 7.5.
Yeah.
There'd be some increases, some decreases. This says now layer in cost of service and the shifting away of a portion of residential revenue responsibility, and pretty much everybody's rate goes down.
And this is still the revenue neutral scenario where we haven't applied any rate increase.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. I'm not saying this is what you would do. It's just trying to illustrate that the impacts of the cost of service are potentially significant in saving money for residential, but you'll hear from your non-residential customers.
Oh, boy. Now, I do need to ask about residential. I know it, non-residential are those people that use water that are outside of the city limits. And do we have those? Are those
The non-residential are commercial and industrial customers.
Oh, I understand. So people outside of the city limits pay the same rate?
Currently, people outside the city limits, with very few exceptions, like the Discovery Center or people served on that system, pay 1.5 times those inside the city rates.
Oh, I
City
see.
limits
So they're paying at a higher rate, not
on both the
significant.
base and the consumptive rate.
That somewhat makes,
It
reasonable.
used to be 2 times. It was ratcheted down a number of years ago to, I think, 1.7 and now 1.5. The original rationale for the outside the city customers to pay at that time twice what the city customers were is that the city was using general obligation bonds to pay for infrastructure improvement, bonds that were repaid based on taxes collected. And the city wasn't collecting any taxes on people that live outside the city
Oh, I
limits.
see.
They paid a higher water rate.
Well,
And so it's still 1.5 times the in-city rates.
That's very typical. Yeah.
but that's a
For
potential
cities.
rate increase that seems reasonable to impose.
We haven't, I guess we haven't even broached that subject, or it wasn't one of the policy questions we thought to ask about, to be honest with you. But if the council had an interest in changing that 1.5 times to something else, that would be useful to know too.
I don't see that as bringing in a significant amount of revenue, right? Am I right? Yeah.
We've got a couple of hundred customers along the transmission lines. That's
Okay.
actually population, not services.
No, but it meets the fairness and equitable, and it seems like if you're using further distance from water sources and it's going to cost more, that living outside of the city and getting that improvement seems like they should be paying at a higher rate, in my opinion.
Most of them are outside to say customers, with some few exceptions here right around the downtown, but most of them are located right along the transmission lines that are
Okay.
coming from Wicks. So it's
Well-
not that we're running additional pipe to them. They're being served by the water as it's going by them in the first place. But anyway, yes, thank you.
Oh, I'm certain my phone will be ringing tomorrow after.
But our current proposed funding is not general obligation bonds, so it wouldn't be paid with tax revenue. So it's a little different.
Yes.
Because it's Google money and it's service fees.
But a revenue bond pays higher interest.
Yes. Okay. Almost through. This is just another reminder of the comparison of the other communities and how their fixed and volume charges and how few include a quantity allowance. This is, quite a range of customers, and only 2 of those, Hood River and West Lynn, include a 5,000 gallon minimum quantity. So using the rates illustrated previously, this was the revenue neutral version of just if you were to reduce the base rate and increase the volume rate in response to that reduction of the minimum quantity, that you would move slightly towards center on that comparison. The next slide just shows the same group of communities with a 10,000 gallon bill. So obviously your bill would increase slightly for a customer, but not enough to you above, because you still have a much higher quantity allowance.
We don't know. That's a great, where there's 20 communities there, something.
Yeah.
That's a good comparison. But we don't know. We don't know, except for the 3, we don't know what the fixed rate is, fixed volume for the other 17
Oh,
communities.
yeah, each
Right.
of these we researched, and the other ones do not have a quantity. They have a base rate. There's no quantity included. So everything above the base rate, any use is charged.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know about what more communities are doing. Are they at 7,500 or are they?
No, so each one of those, what you say in each one of these is 0. Their base rate does not include any water.
The percentage that's shown is just the percent of the bill that is the base charge.
Uh-huh.
It does not include any quantity except for the 2 that are noted there. minimum quantity of 5,000.
The Hood River and Westland are the only ones on that list that include, other than the Dalles.
Maybe I'm not either understanding it or I'm not explaining what my question is very well. I'd be interested to know which of these, are they at 7,500, the other 17, or we don't know what they
They're
are?
at zero.
They're at zero.
They're at zero.
They don't have a minimum quantity.
Okay.
They pay a
At
base
all.
rate and get no water included in that base rate. And so
Wow,
they pay
okay.
on a per thousand or, a unit basis for all the water they use on top of their base rate.
Okay.
All right, we'll move on to commercial. So here the potentially larger change when we go to cost of service. This is just showing this part here is just first looking at reducing the minimum quantity, or in this case, eliminating the minimum quantity. And then because that is 5,000 gallons, and you would pick up a lot more volume that would be applied to the volume rate, you could actually decrease volume rate slightly. But you'll see that there is, for anybody who uses between 0 and 5, the price of that now, is there's going to be a cost to that. So you can see that for like somebody who uses 5,000 gallons, that bill would go up percentage wise somewhat significantly if that were done in one fell swoop, because you've got now 5 times $3.49, where before that was included in that base charge. And the base charge is reduced by about $8, but it doesn't offset that increase from the volume charge. Then when we look at cost of service in the next slide, oh, sorry, this is the histogram. Sorry. Yeah, you're right. This just shows, again, kind of trying to understand both how many customers would that be. And you can see that, they're kind of, a lot of customers would see a bill, many customers would see a bill decrease still, but many would see in that middle range there, which is like, a $3 to $3 to $10 a month increase. So the, percents always, when applied to small dollar amounts, seem scarier, I think, than you look at the actual dollars. But a different story than for residential, that, when you eliminate 5,000 and you start charging for that at a price of $3, close to $3.50, that does have an impact. And then this then layers on the cost of service. So, which again, we have estimated based on the preliminary findings would be a 10% increase overall for commercial. So now your volume rate goes up to $4 per 1,000 gallon, rather than dropping in the prior scenario. And so movement away of that elimination of the minimum quantity, raising the volume rate would have, a significant impact initially, if that were done together. Industrial, removing the minimum quantity really is not a factor. You can see that, at the point that the volumes that they're using is just such a small part of the bill. It's just really, the only thing I want to say about for industrial is that one thing that the cost of service looking at is there's real opportunity to increase those base rates for the industrial customers. They're quite low for, those meters charges. And when you think about, the capacity that you're reserving in the system for those customers, there's an opportunity there, I think, to increase those rates. And that will help offset, as you do reduce the minimum quantities and reduce the fixed charges from the other customers, that would help offset that and balance your fixed and variable revenue recovery. All right. So to summarize this section, I know everybody's getting tired. So the reduction of the quantity allowance to 7.5 will have modest reductions for many customers, modest increases for others, if again, done just alone. Bill increases greater than $20 a month on average are very limited to just a handful of customers. The cost of service-based rates it's a win for residential. Would reduce rates for the majority of customers or help offset increases. Commercial elimination of the 5,000 gallons has more significant increases. It's a larger increment, 5 versus 2.5. And then if you, but the dollar increase in many cases is under $10. The cost of service rates would result in some significant bill increases initially, if that were done as in, combined. And for industrial, absolutely eliminate that allowance has very little effect. And there is definitely justification for shifting some revenue to those customers as a single class or perhaps combined with the commercial class to kind of average out those effects, which would help the commercial customers and increase the rates probably a little bit for industrial compared to having them as a separate. Okay. I think that's what I got.
Jump back into where we are in the process, and then talk about next steps here. So, talked early on about, oh, sorry, thank you. Talked early on about the process and the plan. So we're right at this green step. So developing the capital improvements, working through with staff. So what you saw tonight was preliminary. We'll continue over the next couple of weeks working with staff to finalize the capital improvement plan. The dollars are going to be pretty close, but we'll shuffle some timing, move some things around, and then moving into the step of completing the financial analysis coming out of tonight, the utility rate analysis and system development charges, and then coming back with the final water system master plan for approval. That process is in progress and will go on through the fall into winter, the goal of wrapping up the plan and having it adopted before the end of the year this year. So in terms of next steps, I'll start with where we finished up here, which is to update and finalize the financial analysis and the rate study. A couple items there. One is to develop a final rate option or options based on the council feedback this evening, complete the SDC analysis. As I mentioned, finalize the draft plan that includes ongoing city staff review, OHA review and approval, and then returning to the council for their review and approval. We noted that a communications and public outreach process is important, both in terms of the master plan adoption, but more as it lends itself to the discussion around the financial analysis and rate impacts, and then the public adoption process by this council. And that is it for the formal presentation. Yeah, so what we'll do is go back to some of these policy decisions that we had identified as we went along the way to have some discussion here and get some feedback. Yeah.
Well, so there were the 3 sections, the financial plan. I did hear some feedback there of need to plan for some rate increases sooner rather than later, but need to couple that with some public outreach. So, in the numbers that all the numbers that we had presented, the rate increases were, I think, starting in July of for fiscal year 26, but certainly doing something. Not great to do a rate increase for water in July when water use is highest. It's be much better to do that over the winter sometime. So that would be great. And yeah, so I don't know if there's any more specific feedback on that. Certainly, if we can SIP funding and know and get that kind of narrowed down of what we should be assuming. Brian's going to ask me for a write-up to go in the plan, and I don't know, what we want to have on paper at this point, or just to have as part of these options and determining what your rate increase and public conversation is going to be about. I don't know if you can make that decision right now, but it'd be nice to have a narrower option.
Is it preliminary? Is it too early to put out an estimate for, or a ballpark, I should say, for what we might be thinking of in terms of SIP income for the city?
I mean, there's been several different scenarios based on the value. I mean,
Using a conservative $600 million valuation per data center scenario.
I mean, we can run that scenario and bring that number back, even possibly at the SIP work session
I think that'd be
upcoming in September. That
very
could be very helpful.
In fact, critical. Like, we need that. $3 million, $1 million means nothing out of context, right?
Right.
I think that would be very helpful.
Where'd you come up with the 3 million? I mean, was that based on what we
I made it
thought
up.
Google might-
No, well, I had seen some of the projections and it looked like that or more was probably anticipated. And so we just developed the two scenarios of 1 million and 3 million.
So you just said 3 million was anticipated?
That was what I had seen as far as being within the 3 million is within the numbers I had seen projected.
Okay, but that
And that, I
would
think,
be, I mean, I've seen numbers too, but we have to make a distinction between total tax dollars generated, which go to all the taxing bodies, and how much will be coming to the city.
understood.
So you don't think that, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but you don't think that 3 million is out of the realm of
My
reality?
understanding was 3 million was not out of the realm of possibility.
You agree with that?
Well answered, Dave Anderson.
So maybe we can, like Dan just said, we can fine tune that a little bit and bring that back.
We need to have some operating assumptions without having, prior to having the actual tax assessment done. And understood that we're making best guesses and best estimates, but we have to do that. We have to do that for a master plan. We have to do that for Google too.
Well, it makes our county assessor very nervous when we start doing this, but it's,
Well, and I think in a lot of the approaches here, and I don't mean to speak for you as well, but there's been a conservative notion here, right? And we certainly didn't want to put out a scenario where we were able to keep water rate increases at a very low level, or even see a decrease and have that be perceived as a possibility when it really isn't. And so for some of these revenue sources, we took that conservative approach. We didn't want to set false expectations.
So do you want comments across the board, or do you have specific policy questions you want to?
I think there's a couple of specific, we're interested in your comments across the board as well. But we are seeking some direction on a couple of these items so that we can narrow down the scenarios that are brought back to the council for consideration. I think maybe one of the easier ones might be the amount of water that's included in the base rates. We showed you some scenarios where, and explained some of the issues with our current rate structure. And we run some analysis using including 7,500 gallons instead of the current 10,000 for residential. And we've removed the 5,000 gallon allowance for both commercial and industrial in one of the scenarios we presented. I guess we'd be interested if council has a feeling of whether they support that concept, but we wouldn't spend time on other scenarios than if we got that kind of direction tonight.
well, the three alternatives, as far as that goes, is keeping things the same, which is 10,000, going down to 0, or somewhere in between.
Or somewhere in between, yeah,
Which
5,000,
could be-
7,500.
Be 5,000 or 7,500.
It could be whatever number you pick. I think
Yeah.
there's an argument to be made for 7,500 or less.
Is there anybody here that would like to see us maintain the 10,000 as far as goes a scenario
For residential.
for residential? Yeah.
No, I'm not.
Okay, is there anybody here that would like to see us go to zero?
No.
Okay, so is it too much to ask you to do a 5,000 and 7,500 scenario?
Yeah, I'd
I'm
like
gonna look
know
to
the
Deb.
break-even.
What'd you say?
I'd like to know what the break even is if we drop it to 5,000 base, but with the average users, what the dollar per gallon, so if that matches up with our cost of service or not. So, what I'm trying to figure out is, I think that we need to maintain our floor because we have our low income program and we're trying to raise revenue. But we need to mitigate the impact, on the people that aren't using a lot more water. So I don't want, you know, it's not an ideal world. So looking at what we have and what expenses we have, everyone's going to have to pay a little bit more over time. And if you drop rates, you're just going to turn around and raise them up again in order to do it. So I'd rather have a slower increase or something for people to get used to than a drop and then a rate increase
And I
again.
think maybe just to clarify, and Deb, please help make sure I do this correctly. Those revenue neutral scenarios were presented just so we could understand what those costs would look like by just changing the structure and not trying to bring in more revenue. We know from this conversation, we need to bring in more revenue. So don't get real wedded to those numbers as being the numbers. It's just how they would relate based on reallocation of those costs based on cost of service and customer class.
I'm just stating because I thought I heard some comments from other counselors, so I was just clarifying what I.
Yeah, thank you. So did I hear you want two scenarios continued to be developed? One was 5,000 and one was 7,500 for residential customers?
I agree with that.
And then how about the commercial and industrials? Is there support for eliminating the 5,000 gallon that's included in the base rate, or you want to keep it, or some reduction with them as well?
What I would personally like to see is some thought, I guess, on our end too, towards, um, as Councilor Long said, yeah, we have to step up water rates across the board to some degree. But I would like to shield maybe parks or schools or nonprofits or all of the above. And I mean, they're the same customers. They're our neighbors, whether we drop or raise rates or pass along the pain to other districts. It's a little philosophical. I think we need to raise rates gently and not just try and pass on the need to raise rates significantly through other districts. I think we need to do that, but being mindful of the nonprofits. So I don't know if that's like breakout nonprofit or government entities separate from commercial.
Sometimes, and again, I'm going to look to Deb a little bit, but I guess it's not completely unheard of to have a fourth class, which is government. Right now, we have government within our commercial. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes, the government is identified separately in your billing system, so we know who those customers are and their usage, which tends to trend towards heavy irrigation. So they are, yeah, under the cost of service framework, they pay more. Certainly, having them part of a larger class tends to spread the costs around. So that's one option, is just
They
to,
probably actually benefit
put
from
them
being
back
lumped
in
in
with-
right now with the rest of commercial.
Got it. That makes sense.
yes. You can, you can pull them out separately and then by a policy decision, decide to discount their rate, but then you have to decide who's going to pick up.
Well, let's skip to that part because that's the fun or interesting bottom line in my view. And again, just my 2 cents, but I do think we need to look at a significant step up in rates for industrial customers. In part, A, they can afford it, especially the very largest ones that we're talking about. And B, some of our CIP plan here, our CIP is driven, some of the costs are driven by our industrial customers. So I feel like they should be shouldering the burden for those two reasons.
Would you like my 2 cents? Avoid drastic rate increases. We already know that that's an assumption. Keep rate increases focused on minimal impact on our senior ratepayers. Plan for rate increases during the winter months. That seems like a logical time. And then we're asking you to create a magical, perfect rate plan that will meet the future growth needs plus keep rate low. Now, I'm in favor of you moving forward on that, and I would like to see some options as we go forward. And I would like to look at, from 1, 2, 3, 4 perhaps, and then taking a look at what is the most logical,
I'm sorry, was that
reasonable.
1, 2, 3, 4%?
No,
Oh,
that's 1, 2, 3, 4 steps in
okay, I'm sorry.
recommendations or options back to the council. Because I think you've given us the 7.5, that's an option, and you've also given us some other things to evaluate. But like I said, I'd like a magical plan that you create that will answer all of our problems. No, I'm just kidding.
Can
All
we
right.
take a second to just gut check the assumption that we should be, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you have based this plan on full build out within the urban growth boundary.
Correct. Well, within the next 20 years.
So not full build out of the urban growth boundary, but a projected population. All right. Very good.
I kind of, I do agree with the overall philosophy of having our community look good and which would preclude us, I think, from going to 0 or 5,000 even maybe. So maybe 7,500 would be but you're going to do both, so we can look at both. This is so much to absorb, especially since we just got it tonight. And I know I have a lot of questions that I didn't really want to get into tonight, but I would like a chance to go through this in detail because to better understand all these numbers and maybe come back with another Q&A or something in the future,
Well, I guess that was actually some of the additional, first of all, I would invite you, if you are interested in writing your questions down and submitting them, we'll respond to you
Yeah.
before we get back
All right.
together again so that you have the information that applies certainly to any of the counselors. The second option or the second issue was, I wanted to raise the question tonight. We had planned 2 work sessions and then we're hopeful that we would have, enough direction to bring back a financial plan for adoption and implementation. I think at the last meeting, I floated the idea that it felt to me like maybe we were going to need a 3rd workshop. Do you have a feeling about that issue? Whether you want a 3rd workshop before we actually are bringing you something in a council meeting to ask for adoption? It sounds like we're still going to be bringing back a range of or a number of different options, and perhaps that decision would be helped by more discussion around those options.
I think definitely because usually we get a packet ahead of time and this time it was like you just sprung it on us right here. It's a
We
lot of
did, and actually we
information.
just finished it today, but
So-
that was somewhat intentional. I'll just kind of explain my thinking on
Yeah, I
that
know.
because if we really wanted to have a facilitated conversation because we were concerned about people getting the information, maybe either misinterpreting or not being clear in some form for our opinions already being formed that would have to then be overcome rather than an iterative one. I think we've have enough information since we've had this conversation that another packet, if we were going to have another workshop, would be something we could provide to you in advance that would be useful and understandable at that point.
Just my feedback, 2 cents. I get what you were thinking, but I think it made tonight drag on longer for me because people were asking questions that were coming later in the presentation. And so this took a lot longer than it really needed to if we'd had a chance to read through it and then been able to clarify assumptions, which is kind of what we do with the packet anyway.
Good point. Thanks.
But I still think that the presentation was very thorough and very clear in the presentation, so I appreciate that.
Could you also number the pages? That's kind of a petty thing. So
Yeah.
instead of thumbing
Yes.
through and trying to describe, this is the page, if we could number the pages, that'd be great. So,
Mr. Mayor, I'm sorry, can I circle back? We got some direction on a couple of scenarios to present for the amount of water to be included in the base rates for residential. Was there a direction for the commercial and industrial? Do you want to keep the 5,000 gallons? Do you want to drop it to zero or
Kind of a non-issue for the industrial though, right?
it is a non-issue for the
It's all about the
industrial?
volume price, right?
Hmm?
It's all
Yes.
about the price of,
Oh, yeah.
all right.
But
So-
it does have an impact on the commercials, and one of the things that we mentioned we'll be analyzing is whether it makes sense to combine those again, whether there's an advantage of doing that. So, and I guess if there was a desire by council to have different base rate or different volumes included in the rates for customer versus industrial, that would be an argument for us to keep them separate.
I
We
see you
think there
shaking
might
your
be
head.
some rate
So
benefits of combining them again, rate benefits.
does
to
that seem like a
residential.
proposal or something that would be recommended on the commercial rates? Okay.
We did kind of lightly try to recommend dropping it to zero tonight.
Oh,
is there a fairness issue with that at all? I mean,
yeah, I was thinking that too, but
I mean,
I would think you'd want to keep the 5,000 for the same reason you'd want to keep for the residential, and that is the beautification. If they have
I-
small lawns or areas of garden that they're trying to maintain for their looks of their premises
For commercial only or both classes, both
for
commercial
commercial and and for
Okay.
residential.
well, that leaves some of the other options open to us about whether we recombine them again or not. The commercial and industrial group them together like they used to be again. So
my alarm's going off. If I would like to take this and take the information to one customer who's critical of the rate and at least present it and let that person get feedback from them. And if they say they can absorb it in their this is commercial. And then I could do this and be prepared for the next time, at least and I'm not willing to go forward and say, let's drop or let's maintain yet until I have a chance to look at this. Because I don't know what the impact is going to be on the commercial rates. Well, or on their,
I guess I would just offer the condition again or the clarification, reiteration that the tables in there that have those costs of service,
Yeah.
analyses and things don't include a rate increase yet. So those are the revenue neutral. So I would be, we just got to be careful that people don't misinterpret how far we are in the process and aren't.
I'd like to see the staff too come up with a PR program, so to speak, immediately
We're actually working on that.
yeah,
now.
without getting really specific on the numbers, maybe talk about the issues and the three big projects and what's going to be coming. There's no appetite for raising rates now. Everybody wants to wait
I'm-
till the winter? So
Would be our recommendation to target something like a January 1 implementation date when
Mhm.
people are into their base rates instead of, at peak consumption.
Well, no
You could
matter
do
how,
it.
I mean, we're not
We'd
going to
probably, I'm sorry, go ahead.
we're not going to be ready for a rate decision before the rainy, cold season anyway, right?
well, my thinking
I mean,
is that,
You could do it without having this done.
I mean, we're going to be raising rates significantly, it seems to me, and we could get a head start on it. January, that's fine. I guess I was thinking immediately, but January, whatever you guys want to do, it's
in conjunction with a PR campaign, yes, I think we've got to lay some kind of a plan out for our residents to see so that they know that they're going to have to absorb some of those costs that we have to have for infrastructure improvement. So they need to be partners with us and be a part of this rather than us imposing these things and then we're going to hear about that politically.
well, my question is, do we want to wait till January? And if so, what kind of a rate increase are we looking at? Because we're not gonna, it's kind of a down payment. I see it as whatever we can, whatever we can do. I mean, me.
So I think just process wise and perhaps Matthew and Amy can check me on this. There would have to be a, city council meeting, a public hearing, adoption of a resolution. That a 30-day or 2-week notice? 2-week notice. And our next meetings are in September, October, November, December. We could have something ready that could be effective in the November, December time period. I'm just talking about staff and city council separate from this plan. We're hoping to have this plan ready for city council's adoption by the end of this calendar year. So, but we could begin the other.
Mr. Mayor, I just don't see how it would make sense for us to jump forward with a rate increase prior to being through this plan and have that increase discussion in conjunction with it.
That's fair.
I don't want to raise rates for, X% and then be like, well, it should have been X.5 or
Yeah.
2X, whatever.
And I think just to build on Dave's comments there, I mean, I think if we were to try and move as, quickly as possible, we'd be looking at November, December with a January 1st increase. If we were to move as quickly as possible in conjunction with community communication and some of that PR effort, the information that we have here really informs that process. And we probably, as we're talking this evening, and it seems the council's open to the inevitability of rate increases, we can move forward under that assumption and develop the PR campaign, community outreach accordingly. If the council feedback from tonight was, we really want to hold and wait until, the winter of next year, for example, then the PR campaign and community outreach looks a little bit different because we'll have the results of the water master plan effort to incorporate. We'll have some additional information on even potentially from the SIP program itself that we can incorporate more specifically. And so the feedback that you're giving us this evening, helps us do both of those efforts and what you might be most interested in seeing first and as quickly as possible.
I would offer, just following up on something that city manager just said, with the rate at which inflation has eaten into our existing revenue streams over the last 2 years, I would be concerned about trying to wait till the January of 2026 to do a rate increase. I'm not sure the utility, and we do have one of the data centers going to come online, which is going to help, but I'm not sure that fully answers the question. So of the scenarios he talked about, my recommendation, even though we're only this far through the process, is that we be trying to target an initial rate increase this coming winter. If we miss January 1 and it's February or it's March, so be it. But I would not recommend trying to wait a year
Right.
down the road.
I don't think anybody's suggesting that.
I accept that.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, so let's assume that we're looking at a date of January 1st at the earliest and say March 1st. So sometime between January and February.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, we're also looking at scenarios at 5,000 and 7,500 gallons, a public education plan or staff's going to work on, and coming back with some assumptions as to how much revenue we think Google is going to be generating through the SIP program. Now, we already know what they're generating through the Taylor Lake.
Correct.
Right.
You mentioned the residential, but the commercial, are we looking at a 0 and a 5,000? Or are we just looking at a 0?
I heard some reluctance about going to 0. So do you want us to bring back two scenarios for the
Well, if
commercial?
we're going to keep them separate from the industrial and we still have commercial set aside, to me, that kind of speaks of small businesses and that type of thing. So
Yeah.
So let me float this. For commercial, we would keep the 5,000 gallon, and for industrial, we would go to 0.
I like that. Personally.
Scenarios for residential. Okay, thank you for that direction.
One last question. Where is the county as a partner in all of this? Do they have any responsibilities?
Oh,
Nothing to share? Okay. Just question.
We could try, but no, there's no real connection
No
there at all.
obligation, but would they
Yeah.
commit because the city is the majority of their county? And increased revenues could be dispersed equitable.
I think you should bring that up at the next joint meeting.
boy.
Councilor McLaughlin.
I'll wear a flak jacket before I do.
is there any other, Deb or
So you feel like you have sufficient direction? Okay, so the only thing we need to do now is maybe schedule another work session?
We're gonna need it.
Yeah, so there's a couple things here. I mean, there's the upcoming SIP work session, I believe, in September, which any initial council feedback on, the use of SIP dollars, whatever the amount actually is, would be helpful if the council's open, obviously, to using those SIP dollars in this discussion. Some more clarity may come at that September work session. And then, I mean, we can work with the consultants about scheduling an additional work session after that, perhaps in October. And again, we can work on doodle polling and scheduling that out.
Great. Okay,
Is it worth me asking, I guess, whether the council is interested in us continuing to develop the $3 million SIP scenario? Is that the one we want to kind of focus on? Or
I
do you-
think we need to know first what the staff thinks is a realistic, conservative, but realistic
Understood.
Green.
revenue. Yeah.
I just don't know how hung up we are until we have that direction. Can the financial analysis do much until we,
It's obviously a key assumption. We can focus on finishing up the SDCs and these
Okay.
rate design options, and not in more further tweaking on the financial plan until we have that information.
Okay.
Unless Brian needs a plan from me sooner.
Do you need general comments from council about that, or do you want to wait?
we're here at your pleasure.
I just asked the city manager, I mean, I'd like to see the SIP revenue projections include property tax revenues in addition to gap payment and the community service fee.
It's certainly we can generate those projections, all part of the SIP formula that comes together, which determines the actual gap payment. So to get to the answer on the gap payment, we'll need to have an estimate on what those other variables are. I
Right.
think we were really focused on the gap payment itself, separate from property taxes, which go into the general fund, for example. But I guess, maybe one way to just, pose that scenario is that if the SIP dollars that were coming in were 3 million, would the council want to allocate the entire 3 million to this water master plan? If hypothetically the SIP dollars were 5 million or 6 million, would you want, does your answer change in those kind of scenarios?
Yeah,
I mean, staff can generate those scenarios and bring them back, but even just for this evening, for the utility, for our consultants here, if the gap payment to the city was $3 million, would you want to contribute all of it to this SIP model? If the gap payment was $6 million, does your answer change?
I would say the answer is yes. And I think that even at 3 million, the answer to that would be contingent on what we might expect from the other revenue streams through property taxes and community service fees. With the understanding that not going to the general fund. Right? Is that okay?
That's my preference. Mm-hmm.
I think it might be worth adding, I guess, one additional detail. SIP money is a 15-year revenue stream. We've been talking about 30 and 35-year debt terms. And the assumption was that then when SIP payments run out, these properties come on to the general tax rolls, that then there would be a similar level of contribution from the general fund to continue to pay that debt. And I wanted to be sure that people or the council was aware that that was the assumption we were operating under, rather than getting halfway through the debt cycle and then adjusting utility rates enough to pick up what SIP was doing before.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think because of what the statement I just made previously, I think it's important for us to know what we might expect in property taxes and community service fees and gap payment.
Right.
Even though we might not have any intention of using property taxes or the community service fees. Yeah.
And that would be, and I appreciate you adding that last point, Mr. Mayor, with the needs of other departments throughout the city, and the fact that tonight we're speaking about the largest, but is one of 4 master plans.
Right. Okay, anything else? You feel you have sufficient direction?
No.
Mr. Manager?
The consultants and our public works director are saying yes, so yes.
Okay. Well, then, is there any other business to come before the city council tonight? We're adjourned.